From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for coming to our Books and Beyond program today. I'm Guy Lamolinara from the Center for the Book, and for those of you who don't know about the Center, we're the section of the library that promotes books, reading, libraries, and literacy, and we do it here in Washington, but also nationally through our affiliated Centers for the Book. We have one in every state. There's one here in the District of Columbia, and we also have one even in the U.S. Virgin Islands. Another thing we have is a partnership of 80 like-minded literacy organizations that work with us to promote books and reading. And of course, we work on the National Book Festival by inviting all the authors and setting up the schedule for the programs. And if you want to learn more about the Center for the Book, we're at read.gov. Just before we get started, I need to let you know that we're filming this today for later webcasting. So if you ask a question, you in fact are going to become a part of our webcast. Our webcasts are available on the site at read.gov, and there are more than 200 of those webcasts available now. If you've missed any of our previous Books and Beyond programs, you can see them there on read.gov. And I want to let you know that the author's book today will be for sale outside this room, and she will be doing the book signing there. So the book will be sold at a discount, and then you can get it signed right there. And it'll also give you a chance to speak more with the author. We often are asked how we determine how we do these Books and Beyond programs and how we select the books, and really the major criterion is that the book be researched here at the Library of Congress. And we're also fortunate to be able to co-sponsor these programs with other divisions, and today we're doing that with the music division here at the library. And I'm pleased to introduce Kevin LaVine, a senior music specialist in the reference section of the library's music division, where he also holds primary curatorial responsibility for that division's archival collections of Russian material. Kevin will introduce our speaker today, so please welcome Kevin LaVine.
Well, thank you so much for coming, first of all. And without any further ado, I'd like to acknowledge the efforts of the Center of the Book, Guy Lamolinara, Ann Boney, John Cole, the music division's staff, primarily its concert office, Nick Brown and David Plylar, and of course our sound engineers, Mike Turpin and Jay Kinlock. Thank you again. Also like to thank the staff of the University of Rochester Press for participating in making the event possible. For most of us here at the library, the name Nicolas Slonimsky is associated with the best ideals of scholarship, meticulous research skills, an uncommon musical sensibility, and a profound dedication to whatever musical art he touched. As an author, musicologist, conductor, composer, pianist, teacher, theoretician, and lexicographer, Slonimsky's contributions to the scholarship of Western music are both inestimable and enduring. Nicolas Slonimsky was born into an educated and cultured musical family in Tsarist Russia in 1894 and pursued his initial musical training in his native St. Petersburg, studying piano with his aunt, Isabella Vengerova, whose later pupils included Leonard Bernstein and Samuel Barber, and composition with noted composer Reinhold Glier. Slonimsky moved to Paris after the Russian Revolution and was engaged by Serge Koussevitzky, who was soon to make a name for himself as the conductor of the Boston Symphony Orchestra, as a rehearsal pianist and secretary. Slonimsky emigrated to the United States in 1923 and quickly became involved in the American cultural milieu, obtaining a coaching position at the Eastman School of Music in Rochester, New York, and associating himself with the leading musical figures of the era. But it's perhaps for his contributions as a musical lexicographer that Slonimsky is best remembered today, a career path that Slonimsky himself described as a muddy field into which he blundered, having assumed the editorship of Baker's Biographical Dictionary of Musicians in 1958, expanding the original dictionary, which was first published as a single volume by Theodore Baker in 1900, exponentially, scrupulously verifying its content and turning the work into a major multi-volume reference source that it is today. As a musical theoretician, Slonimsky's Thesaurus of Scales and Melodic Patterns, published in 1947, an inventory of all conceivable and even inconceivable, according to Slonimsky, musical patterns proved influential to musicians as diverse as pioneering jazz saxophonist and composer John Coltrane, innovative rock musician composer Frank Zappa, and contemporary art music composer John Adams. Equally invaluable as scholarly resources are his Music in Latin America of 1945, Music Since 1900 of 1937, a day-to-day chronology of musical events in the 20th century, as well as several translations, articles, a 1988 autobiography titled Perfect Pitch, and other writings collected and published in recent years by his daughter Electra Slonimsky Yourke, and comprising no less than 6 volumes. As a conductor, Slonimsky was one of the first to champion the contemporary music of his time, introducing to the public the works of visionary composers such as Charles Ives, Henry Cowell, Edgar Varese, Carlos Chavez, and Silvestre Revueltas, composers whose names have since become established in the roster of musical luminaries of the 20th century. Slonimsky died in Los Angeles in 1995 at the age of 101, bringing to a close, as he writes in an obituary that he himself penned, one of the most remarkable careers in the annals of 20th century music. One may safely state that here, as always, Slonimsky was not exaggerating. His enormous archive, including personal papers and research documentation, compiled in the course of his scholarly activities and occupying some 500 linear feet of shelf space, has been preserved within the collections of the Library of Congress's Music Division. But despite Slonimsky's irrepressible sense of humor, evident on every page of even his most scholarly writings, we are much less acquainted with his more personal side and his life as a devoted husband and father. During his travels throughout the world as conductor, musicologist, and de facto cultural ambassador, Slonimsky wrote almost daily to his wife, art critic and journalist Dorothy Adlow, and daughter Electra. The effervescent, witty, keenly observant, and occasionally poignant letters that resulted vividly recount the adventures and impressions of one who has lived his life at the crossroads of cultural and historical movements. This correspondence, housed within the library's Slonimsky collection, serves as the basis for Dear Dorothy, letters from Nicolas Slonimsky to Dorothy Adlow, recently published by University of Rochester Press, Electra Slonimsky Yourke's 7th and most recent collection of her father's writings. So without further ado, let me introduce, it's my honor to present Electra Slonimsky Yourke.
Thank you very much. Wonderful. Wonderful life summary that you did. It's really very good. I've hopscotched through the book in order to select letters that I thought would be amusing or interesting or about important figures. So you're not going to see a lot of coherence or continuity here. I've been selective on the basis of what may read well and sound well. The letters start in 1931, or the ones in the collection, and go through 1963. So we're covering a broad swath. And they're in 3 or 4 sort of tranches. The first group is 1931 and 1932. Oh my God, is that my BlackBerry? Excuse me. I do have a job as well. 1931 and 2, in which he went to Paris in 31 and Paris and Berlin and Budapest in, God, it was, in 1932. And Henry Cowell, there was an alleged organization called the Pan American Composers, something that was invented basically by Henry Cowell and largely financed by Charles Ives, was the alleged sponsor of his tour. So he went over, he contracted with a sort of pickup orchestra in Paris and in 31, and it went very well. It created a lot of controversy, and the next year in 32, they developed a more expansive itinerary and a couple of concerts in Paris and then in Berlin, which turned out to be a really important one, and then also in Budapest. So the letters in 31 are, I didn't pick them all up because all of these letters are to my mother or to me. Because my mother came over in the middle of the period, and they got married. It was apparently not planned that they were going to get married, because a couple of letters before he says, well, why don't you come over, you know, do come. And then she comes over, and then so the first letter that I want to read to you, which is not very long, seems to be written on practically a scrap of paper. June 1931. My dear Dorothy, I am rehearsing at Salle Gaveau until about 5:30 p.m. Will be home as soon as I am through. Cannot believe my eyes and your French. You and me and Paris. It's unreal. It's unreal. And they were, I don't know whether that was before or after the marriage, but they were married on June 30th at the mairie, and Varese was the best man. So, so that's the end of the letters, because there they are together. Don't know what happened after that. So the next letter for the next round of concerts is in February 1932. And there is an incredible commotion in connection with the Ruggles score. The Berlin Hall has a capacity for only 70 men. It is plenty for all the works except the Ruggles. But such is the desire to put it on that we'll probably go to a larger hall and change the date. I think it's crazy. Anyway, I wired to Berlin to try to enlarge the stage and simultaneously cabled to Cowell about the situation. The parts cannot be copied here in time, but they are being sent to me from New York. I'm afraid Ives is paying for everything. He is doing the cabling, too. Frankly, I'm scared about my appearance with a huge orchestra, with everybody present in a huge hall. I couldn't sleep for 3 days just imagining things. I don't know my scores, and the Ruggles score is in such a state that I don't know how to manage it. It cannot be bound because of lack of time, and all other means of putting it together are inefficient. I am beginning to know the arcana, that's Varese. I have been pounding it on the piano for several days. It is rather unpleasant to see one's name posted in quite as large letters as is mine. Monday is my first encounter with the orchestra. If they don't say merde alors, I will be quite satisfied. Why, oh why, did I leave my bed and board to become prey to such anxieties? Darius Milhaud has been sending all sorts of letters to Varese and to me to have me play his suite on the gala concert when he will be in Paris. He is now in Spain. You're laryngitis-stricken, panic-stricken, and lonesome, Nicholas. February 27th, so this is a few days later. The orchestra did not want to play Ives, Cowell, Rudyard, and particularly Ruggles. I could not very well change over the program and fail in my obligations towards the group that gave me money. And then there was Bela Bartok, who arrived 2 days before the concert and demanded 2 rehearsals. Well, there was plenty of trouble. I cut down 1 movement of Cowell and 1 of Rudyard, but saved the Ives. To complete the program, I put in Mussorgsky's Night on Bald Mountain, and this and the Mozart were my greatest triumphs. The Americans were a complete flop this time, not excluding Ives. There was no success Sunday in a very sparsely populated hall. But Thursday, I rose to unsuspected heights. Schlosser said he never heard a concerto accompanied the way I did with Rubinstein and the Brahms. Rubinstein was most enthusiastic and shaking hands. As to the Arcana, I think I put myself over definitely in Paris by conducting it. At the general rehearsal, there were all the critics present, and Varese says they were most enthusiastic. Honegger, Milhaud, Prokofiev, Poulenc, Rieti, Cherepanine, and many lesser lights were all there. Prokofiev said he particularly appreciated my left hand. Varese was beaming all over. According to him, I am formidable, great, and unsurpassable, and Stokowski is a mere child in comparison. He says I'm in for a great career and whatnot. He arranged a huge reception for me, and I was paraded in state. Of course, I feel ironical about his predictions, but I admit I myself was impressed with my own success. The orchestra played marvelously, and the men, who at first were terribly opposed to me and to the whole business, admitted that I was épatant in what I got out of them. In fine, your Kolinka made good. I am definitely and irrevocably a personality in Paris, and my suppressed complexes are completely gratified. Then Berlin, a few days later. I had a rehearsal this morning right from the train. The Germans are marvelous. Now I know how the horns can play, And what intelligence. In 2 hours, I rehearsed the Ives piece and the Varese, sometimes pages and pages, without a stop. I told him in my renascent German how much impressed I was. Incidentally, my rehearsing technique is about 50 million miles away from former times. Already for the second Paris concert, I could increase my efficiency by a considerable margin, and now it goes still better. So there is merit in conducting, after all. That is, in the preparatory work, not in the waving of the arms. So that concert was an enormous success, and he got reviews in the German press that you would have to invent. They were so extraordinary. Now, he went in 1933, he was invited to conduct some concerts at the Hollywood Bowl. And he did altogether, I think, 5 concerts in 2 weeks, all with these innovative programs. When you look at the constant programs are in the book, you can't imagine how anybody could have conducted programs of that complexity and length. And coming in very late, not very many rehearsals. There were other concerts in between, so it was quite a scene. And I think I have one letter from there which gives just the merest snippet of what was going on, because there was a lot of controversy and opposition. A complication arose today on account of Roy Harris's overture. After this morning's rehearsal, the chairman of the orchestra, an old flute, I think he is an Englishman, he speaks excellent literary English, arose and said that in my own interests, I must take off the Harris work because it was, quote, ill-chosen for the Hollywood Bowl. During the intermission, every musician came up to me with the same horror story. The concertmaster said it would prove disastrous in the bowl and on the air. Finally, the second violinist representing the program committee said the overture was taken off the program and that I would bear no responsibility since it was a force majeure. In the afternoon, I went over to discuss the matter and the overture was restored, but I don't know what will happen tomorrow at my short 50-minute rehearsal with all men in rebellion. I am strangely calm and self-possessed through all this, which is a good sign, but poor Roy Harris with his ideas of, quote, growing demand for his music, end quote. On what planet does he live? This morning, every Jewish Job's comforter of the orchestra came up to me and tried to dissuade me from playing Schoenberg. The argument is always the same. It drives away the crowd. Goossens played modern works and was never engaged again. There is no personal feeling against me, but it's in my own interests, etc., etc. In the same monotonous scale. Needless to say, I do not intend to put anything off. In 1941, he was invited to visit supposedly all the countries in South and Central America by the Fleischer Library of Philadelphia as part of a project to collect music in the raw, so to speak, literally just the scores, for a WPA-funded music copying project that was taking place as part of an attempt to keep music copyists employed, which I don't know how they can ever be employed. But in any case, he was to collect scores from various composers and ship them back, and they would be copied and the parts would be created. And it was done by, sponsored by Edwin Fleischer, who was quite a visionary, not such a nice guy, it would appear. So this letter is from Rio, August 30th, 1941. Can you hear me? Am I going too fast or anything like that? No? Okay. Or too slowly. Spent a whole day with Villa-Lobos. I went to his rehearsal with a chorus of 5,000 boys and girls, which he conducts through a microphone. He has all kinds of tricks to teach children and even bawls them out if they are not dressed properly. But he has no children of his own. He introduced me to his wife, but Fernandez said she is no wife, but a peroxide blonde, and that Villa-Lobos has a real wife who is a vocal instructor at the conservatory. Villa-Lobos' office is a madhouse. He is managing a division of education or something, and I have a suspicion that he lacks administrative talents. Walt Disney is in Rio and called on Villa-Lobos while I was there. During the conversation, it developed that Walt Disney's favorite record is Ionization, which my father had conducted. He wants to have something by Villa-Lobos for his second Fantasia, and Villa-Lobos suggested that I should conduct his music for the film. Disney took my address, and anyway, he knows me by Ionization. He says he will get in touch with me in December. Maybe. I often think of how people eventually get what they want. When I was a child, I dreamed exactly of the sort of thing I'm doing now, very international, very spectacular, humorous, multilingual, slightly sensational. Airplanes, exotic lands, stunts, some actual accomplishment, recognition slightly off base, multifarious application. I really ought to be happy, and sometimes I think I am, but only don't know it. After all, money troubles are not my special affliction. Others have their money troubles too, and worse. I know genuine happiness in contemplating my return to you and babykins, that would be me, and my trip will feed my imagination for a long time, so I should not complain. Next stop, well, not next stop, next letter, Santiago. This is December 13th, 1941. After the first few days' war scare, normal travel is resumed and ships sail, even though the American line does not announce the sailings. The Nazi Chilean paper features Japanese successes, but another fascistic paper is gradually veering towards Pan-American policy. All intellectuals here are, of course, anti-fascist, and some are quite openly communistic. I received a letter from Andres Sas, the Peruvian composer, with succinct descriptions of his colleagues, including such nice definitions as a madman, a fake, ignoramus, etc. But I will investigate for myself without trusting anybody's judgment. Next letter is from Lima. I went to Chavez's concert last night. He conducted an open-air concert, and I had an opportunity to meet several more composers, that is, those that can stay under the same constellation without starting a fight. The most curious circumstance here is that none of the Peruvians can orchestrate, and all orchestrations are done by a very talented Austrian refugee, a first-class composer himself, whose name I've got in my book. That was Rudolf Holtzmann. For his work, he gets paid the price that a copyist gets to copy a score in the States. December 18th. I spent an exciting day amid the ruins of the Temple of the Moon in the desert in the company of Julio Tello, who discovered it, Luis Valcarcel, the director of the Archaeological Museum, Chavez, who was here on tour, Ponce, Sas, and others. Tello is a Harvard graduate, but three-quarters Indian, and speaks of the pre-Inca cultures with passion. It was very interesting. One woman in the party found a fragment of a pre-Inca textile, and I was very sore that I wasn't the one to find it. You would have had the time of your life in the Archaeological Museum, in which Chimu, Nazca, and Tiahuanaco objects occupy whole sections of the museum. Incidentally, there's a special pornographic section with phallic pictures and copulating figures in various positions, inversions, and perversions, demonstrating that pre-Incas were as expert as the Romans in the ars amandi and its ramifications. I tried to absorb as much as I could of the pre-Inca wonders. My art appreciation is getting better, and I'm sure my choice of textiles is right. After the visit to the ruins, I became fascinated with the pre-Inca things. It was rather weird to tread upon the sand with human bones sticking out of the soil. Managua. A new twist was added in Managua, where I was greeted as a representative of heroic Russia and given credit for the action of the Red Army. The sole composer of Nicaragua, Luis Delgadillo, introduced me in ringing terms as a, quote, beautiful meteor that passed through Nicaraguan skies. I had to stand through this speech, broadcast all over Central America, and smile pleasantly. There was a front page story of my arrival greeting me in the second person. You are arriving, Nicolas Slonimsky, when the soul of Russia, etc., etc. I am going through the motions of collecting scores, giving lecture recitals, etc., with a professional efficiency of automatic precision, lecturing without notes in Spanish, paying inflated compliments to the musicians of each country, and learning their compositions in a few hours before performance. The wonder is that I don't get mixed up in names, titles, geographic places, etc., even though I have no time to read up on much about the history and geography of each country. This is a process of adaptation which either does me credit or shows a dangerous degree of assimilative powers. Now that I have got what I wanted, I want, above all, to go home. I suppose it is all very normal. In fact, normal desires have great attraction for me. I hope I will be a better man when I get back. Mexico City. They tell me that my article on Alberto Williams is out. I'm glad for the old man's sake. for he was simply wonderful to me in Argentina. It is not his fault that he is not a genius. But last night I spent at the house of the sister of a genius, Silvestre Revueltas, who died of drink and dissipation over a year ago. He left 26 scores, and there is a mark of genius on every note he wrote. Even Time called him the late great. His sister will have all his music photostated for the Fleischer collection. I had an intellectual thrill and even took 3 glassfuls of martini. Chavez has a huge son and 2 huge daughters. There was no sign of a senora, and I didn't ask any questions. He was very nice, jocular, but there is a sense of his knowing that he's important, which he cannot conceal. I was in Manuel Ponce's house the other day. He lives in Chapultepec, which is a suburb. We sat in the garden under the warm sun and discussed politics and music. He told me how Revueltas lived and died. Someone must write the life of Revueltas. I never met him, though we were in correspondence, and I gave the first performance of any of his works in the States 9 years ago. There are more composers in Mexico than in any given country, and interesting composers, too. Half of them are communists. I'm going to see the pyramids. Would you like me to stop now before doing the Russian letters, or would you like me to keep going? Keep going? Yes. Okay. So this is Russia. In 1962-3, he was sent by the State Department on an informational tour to disseminate American musical materials and to speak about American music. And since he was Russian and spoke a number of the languages where he was visiting, it was a good pick. And he was the most enthusiastic possible musical ambassador. At the same time, of course, he was collecting materials for his own dictionaries and lexicographical pursuits. He arrived on the day of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Timing is everything. Dear Electra, some of these letters are to me as well. This is Moscow. I am in a huge room which looks positively indecent in its luxurious appurtenances and/or accoutrements, and no wonder. This hotel is remodeled from the famous Moscow restaurant Yar, where the brothers Karamazov used to entertain gypsy girls. The Cuban business looms large in Pravda, and the headlines are scary. Incidentally, Soviet headlines are always in the first-person plural imperative. Let us bridle the unloosened imperialist circles of USA, or verbless appeals with exclamation points. Resolute rebuke to the inflamers of war, exclamation point. But the radio broadcasts are factual and are reported in clear, actor-like voices. I am still overwhelmed by everything to think coherently. Hope to get organized brain-wise today. Next letter. So many things happen that it's difficult to arrange a chronological report. Theater every night or a concert. Took in Prokofiev's War and Peace at the Bolshoi. What a production. I sat in loge seat number 1, needless to say. I was picked up at the hotel, and the ticket was provided for me in advance. Incidentally, a dark-haired, 50-ish Russian woman came up to me at a dinner and said, "You don't recognize me, but I knew you at once." I had to ask her who she was. It was Prokofiev's first wife. She exhibited unexpected friendship for me, and switching to English, told me a lot of things in the first 5 minutes, e.g., that she spent 8 months in prison and 9 years in a concentration camp, and, which was quite a revelation, that she was never divorced and that her successor was never legally married to Prokofiev. Conversation is fantastically free. A young composer told me he was indignant about the building up of armaments in the USSR, and that all this money could be used for housing improvements, betterment of consumers' goods, etc. A Soviet airman asked me whether I was reading the local press, and didn't I think it distorted the news. I was actually embarrassed and answered him by a generality. As to music and the arts in general, the official line is held in contempt, and its spokesmen are virtually boycotted by composers and artists. Dodecaphony, but recently recognized as the work of the devil, is all the rage. Professional composers keep asking me about the most recent developments in the field. Their interest in my own theories and in my thesaurus is such that I feel both elated and humbled by their attention. The secretary of the Union of Soviet Composers, that's Khrennikov, told me in the most effusive terms that my visit here was an event and that the composers and musicologists were profoundly impressed. In fact, he used stronger superlatives. Today, we all went to the House of Creative Rest or something, about 100 kilometers from Moscow, and a huge banquet was tendered to the various delegates, 2 from France, 1 from Italy, 1 from Romania, 1 from Bulgaria, 1 from Poland, 1 from Japan. Krennikov insisted that I should sit on his right, a signal honor, and his wife kept taking my pictures with her German Democratic Republican camera while I was eating my soup. The radio goes on at 6 a.m. and goes off at midnight, so I leave the juice on and the radio wakes me up. They have 5 minutes of news every hour, sort of Huntley-Brinkley team, a man and a woman. Their method of news reporting is maddening. They broadcast important news only once and drop it afterwards, but report various reactions by such people as the lathe worker at the Red Excavator Unit, actual fact. Khrushchev's first message to Kennedy about Cuba, offering to remove the missile bases, came through in the afternoon, but I learned about it only from expressions of phrase from workers and peasants, without any indication as to the nature of the message. Pravda is usually sold out in an hour, and it arrives at the hotel at an uncertain time between 9 and 10 in the morning. And if you don't catch it, then you have to wait for Izvestia, which is the afternoon paper. If you miss that, you have to wait for the London Daily Worker, which is the most dismal. I got the full texts of Kennedy's messages to Khrushchev at the embassy in the embassy bulletins. Incidentally, the embassy gets only 2 or 3 copies of the Times and the Trib, and they disappear at once. No time either, some fix. Somehow I managed to survive. Maybe I can be trained to live without the newspapers. An interesting idea. Kiev. My mind now automatically works in Russian. It is amusing how I am picking up Soviet expressions and changed idioms and even the melodic inflection. On my last day in Moscow, there was a huge rustic banquet at the House of Rest for Creative Workers. There was speech making, and Karen Khachaturian, the nephew of Aram Ditto, drank a toast for me and used such superlatives that I was actually embarrassed. It seems that Prokofiev and Miaskovsky often referred to me, half facetiously, as the best source of information about their own work, and this has found its way into published accounts and created a legend. Then another composer welcomed me as a representative of the USA and said something that in spite of political difficulties, emissaries from America are always received with interest and honor. Karen Khachaturian then suddenly cried out, "But he is our own Russian!" I thought it was so wonderful and sincere that I applauded, and so did Krennikov. In my response, oh yes, I did a lot of speechifying. I said that I am a twin of myself, American and Russian, and this evoked a lot of applause. Lena Ivanovna Prokofieva was translating this exchange into French, and my old friend by correspondence, Gregory Schneerson, into another language. Then Kiev. And this morning I paid a visit to the Dodecaphonic Underground, a strikingly handsome couple, both 26, he a talented conductor, she a musicologist. I have been in correspondence with him for a couple of years. You know, you'll see in this letter, they are not identified by name because all the mail is being opened. They are Blashkov, Igor Blashkov, and his wife Galina Mokreyeva. I've been in correspondence with him for a couple of years, and he helped me to crack the most recalcitrant dates and facts about Simonovsky, a Polish modernist, and a lot of Russians. He also read music since 1900 from cover to cover and compiled a list of corrections and suggestions. I had no idea he was 26. His wife is equally versed in everything. Well, he told me a hair-raising tale of persecution on the part of the reactionary musicians here. He was kicked out of his conductor's post for having collaborated with his wife in publishing a review of the Ukrainian festival in Kiev in a Polish music journal, condemning in very strong terms virtually the whole setup in the conservatory and extolling the music of a young dodecaphonic beatnik who was expelled from the conservatory for the sin of Schoenbergianism. I met the beatnik too, and also another young dodecaphonist. We gathered in the married couple's apartment, in which the piano occupied 2/3 of the living room, and the beatniks played their dodecaphonic music for me. I was greatly impressed by their ability to express themselves lyrically in this severe idiom. They were also excellent pianists. Some of these pieces have already been performed in the most far-out West German music festival in Darmstadt. Such alliances certainly did not endear them with the powers that be, but there were no actual reprisals. However, they told me that publishing their music in the West might possibly lead to criminal indictments. And of course, there was no question about publishing this kind of stuff in Kiev. Leningrad is much more liberal. I must add a footnote. This incident that he talked about, where there were arrests and there were reprisals and so forth, was reported. It was reported that the KGB had uncovered what it called, quote, a Masonic lodge of dodecaphonists, end quote. You can't make this stuff up. Yerevan, Armenia. I flew in from Tbilisi yesterday. Mount Ararat seemed to hang in space over a layer of haze, and it was a majestic sight, such a severe, austere, snow-covered peak. It is in Turkey, and the Armenians sadly look at it from Yerevan. It seems as though it is situated right in the middle of the town. A little farther, beyond Little Ararat, a companion mountain, is Iran. Every musician in town, Tbilisi that is, came to hear my talk on my scales and things, and the composers took notes like schoolboys. Most gratifying, can't deny it, particularly since these composers are masters of their craft, no matter what can be said about their idiom. Everybody knows Charles Ives. How ironic and how remarkable. I am still amazed at the mental vitality of people here. One is not aware of any barriers, and only a few officials ever inject a political note in conversations, usually in the form of peace and friendship. News-wise, I live in a state of suspended animation. Somehow I manage to live without the New York Times, but I do get some bits of general news from the Daily Worker of London, L'Humanité and Unità. Even crimes are reported in these papers. So I am using every moment here to listen to tape-recorded Armenian music, operas, symphonies, chamber music. All this flows out of some cornucopia, and how they maintain such a high grade of production with such limited facilities is beyond me. And what performers. Every violinist is practically an Oistrakh and every pianist a Richter. Moscow. If there is one striking quality of people in the USSR, it's affection. It takes more than international comedy, let alone propaganda, for the director of the Conservatory of Baku and the head of the music fund to come to see me off at the airport at 6 a.m. Something also happened to the Russian language. It is luxuriating in diminutives. Give me a little tea with a little bread with a little butter. They call waitresses and conductresses maiden, a word that was never used in such prosaic contexts when I was young. Then there is a new inflection, deliberate, melodic, much slower than in my time. They scan the commas and they give a cadence to the full stop. I notice with amazement that I am picking up this Soviet talk. I have already learned all the new idioms and technical terms, and since my American clothes are no longer conspicuous and my shoes, elegant as they are, no longer attract attention, I am taken everywhere for a native. People ask me directions and on buses ask me what's the next stop. Another thing, they use the familiar do form with strangers, women to men on buses, militiamen to younger people. Friends are on do terms almost universally. And the kissing, God. Then Israel, Herzliya in Israel. I walked along along Ben Yehudi Avenue, and without straining my imagination overmuch, I could imagine that it was Lower Broadway. Signs in Hebrew and in English, bookstores, kiosks, American newspapers, Time, girly magazines. The New York Times arrives on the same day from Paris at last. Had the longest day Monday, a 2-hour talk at the Music Academy and a 2-hour talk at the Artists Club. The first in the afternoon, the second in the evening. For the evening show, I was introduced in Hebrew by the secretary of the club, who came in laden with photographs of my grandfather at the age of 94, blurbs of my Latin American music book and other documentation. He spoke like a prophet of old, and words rang out so majestically that at the end of his lengthy introduction, I began to understand Hebrew. I can now read the signs, and I can say shalom and a few other key words. I had a most distinguished and populous audience, composers, writers, a famous girl pianist whose concert I heard here last week, reporters, and I made a hit, if I say so myself. I started with stories about my grandfather, which went with a bang, and then began talking about me. Went quite deeply into dodecaphony and such matters for the benefit of the musical contingent, and played a lot. After the show, several very ancient people came up to me and began by saying in Russian, "You don't remember me, but..." One woman who said we were together a lot in Yalta in 1920 is still a mystery to me. She said I was fascinating at the time and could recite Pushkin's Eugene Onegin by heart. I still can, if provoked. A fantastically ancient man came up and said, "You don't remember me, but," and told me that in 1919, I recited Pushkin's Eugene Onegin by heart. This began to wear on me. Sofia, Bulgaria. I never suspected that my days would be so full in Bulgaria, and that, good, I'm glad somebody else did it, and that they would also be so cold. I wear everything wearable, my flannel shirt, a sweater, a Greek scarf, but I must say that I felt shivery returning last night by tramway, no taxi cabs in Bulgaria, from the suburban house of the top Bulgarian composer Pancho Vladigerov, whom I knew when, and who attended my concerts in Berlin in 1932. We spent a profitable 6 hours together around an electric stove that produced glow but no heat, and a coal stove that produced old-fashioned warmth. He played a lot of his music on tapes and exclaimed at every cadence, "Das ist Musik." Shostakovich told me it was a unique work. Richard Strauss looked into the score and became speechless. This is from the heart, indicating the position of the organ in his ample chest, not from the head, touching his gray but abundant locks, while his second wife watched him admiringly. But really, his stuff has quite a lot of highly likable schmaltz. I made a faux pas by mentioning that I had abundant lunch at Lubomir Pipkov's and was therefore full. "Pipkov," he exclaimed. "He was my pupil, but..." Deleted just in case the envelope becomes accidentally ungummed. Also, Sophia. 2 receptions in my honor were held at the residence of Mrs. Eugenie Anderson, the U.S. minister, one on March 6th at 8 for dinner with a few select people, and a buffet party on the next day at 5:30. I stood in the reception line next to Madam Minister and her husband and shook hands. I think I was never so fastidious about my toilette. Changed shirts on both days, had my blue suit pressed, adjusted my collar, adjusted my necktie, the striped one, no tuxes. I also brilliantined my hair with a really brilliant brilliantine gifted to me by Mrs. Minister, who had asked me whether I needed any American and or French products. She sent me not only that, but also 2 boxes of Kleenex and other such things unthinkable in Bulgaria. I radiated charm, played music suited to all tastes. Madam Minister studied for 2 years at Juilliard, was extremely careful of my table manners, and did not feel the breads or tear cold cuts in 2 from the plate, which some Boston Bulgarians are in the habit of doing. Budapest. Despite my determination not to tackle Hungarian, I found that I could not tolerate the sight of signs which I could not even remotely connect with any roots in any language. So I got myself a book and am digesting Magyar vocables by the dozen. Thank goodness the plural is simple, just add K. But who's ever heard of a K plural? Also, no gender, he, she, or it are all the same, ridiculous. And no auxiliary verbs. Tarzan must have been a Hungarian. In fact, the first movie, Tarzan, was a Hungarian. No wonder the Gabor sisters talk the way they do. But the vowels change in one word if the next word has incompatible vowels, and this is hell. I am on my own, no more committees waiting on my pleasure, no more chauffeured limousines. Musicians do not fare in Hungary as well as in Romania or Bulgaria. Low pay. The editor of the encyclopedia referred to above, that's in another letter, said he could not afford a new pair of shoes in 12 years. Also, he has to take orders. For instance, Stravinsky was canceled out in a music dictionary and was reinstated only after his visit to Russia. I went over his materials and was flabbergasted to find dozens of names of second-rate Russian singers with extensive coverage, while world-famous figures of opera in the West were not as much as mentioned. But he explained that he has to have an absolute plurality of Russians over non-Russians. Hungarian emigrants, no matter how illustrious, are out, but if they die, they are automatically in. A very unusual way of compiling a dictionary. Budapest. Went to tea at Zoltán Kodály's, the 81-year-old dean of Hungarian music. A very young girl opened the door and said in excellent English, "I am Mrs. Kodály. My husband is expecting you." She was born in 1940, he in 1882. He married her when she was 19, 3 years ago, shortly after the death of his first wife, who was 96. I knew these facts and figures before I went to see Kodály. So the last letter, I think, is a nice bookend for the first one. Paris, May 17th. Dear Dorothy, so this is Paris. I took a home in a small hotel, Helvetia, 23 Rue Tournon, Paris 6e, in the Latin Quarter, so familiar to me since my early days in Paris. Even the smell of the pavement catalyzes remote memories, and I have once more the sense of crossing my past. Love, N. Nice. Thank you. Only a sample.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. Those are wonderfully chosen, really appropriate. Since we're running out of time a little bit, I just wanted to limit my own questions, just a few questions. Quickly, how accurate do you think the Russian letters reflected your father's state of mind? Since obviously he knew that they were probably being probed by censors, and one can certainly read between the lines. They seem to have that gravity to them.
Yeah.
Do you feel that that's an appropriate?
Interesting question. I think he accentuated the positive, but as you can see even from what I read, his experience was extremely positive. I mean, he was treated marvelously. He hadn't been in Russia since, I think, the 30s, so there was a tremendous feeling of revisiting and at the same time being surprised by the changes that he experienced. The language, he keeps mentioning how the language has changed. And so the experience, the people there, he says, the people are so friendly, and so he was overwhelmed by that. But his ideas about his knowledge of the regime was uncompromisingly negative, but you certainly don't write that into letters home, particularly when you're being treated in such a princely fashion. No, he was very anti-Soviet, and you can see he keeps looking for positive things to say. Well, people are interested. I mean, he was visiting countries, visiting musicians in these countries, and they were asking him about music that was current in the West, and they had no access to it at all. No access whatever. They were living in the past, and they were very eager. And Blashkov, that was a very interesting, if anybody's interested in the names of the others that were in that room, they were terribly eager, and they were subjected to oppression for this. So I can't answer that, but I think most of all, what affected him was that how well he was welcomed. It was his own experience.
It must have been wonderful to him to actually reconnect with his roots.
And he was, and also I took out the personal stuff, but he visited with his brother there, and extensively, and that was the neurotic part of it. I mean, his brother was, very elderly, and his wife had had a stroke many years ago, and all she could say was poo, poo. But she understood everything, and he keeps describing these visits where he says things, and she, in many inflections, when it's clear that she understands what, then she's saying something, but the only sounds she can utter are poo, poo. Yeah, so.
Another question I had was about what was life like when you were growing up in the Slonimsky household? I mean, with two illustrious parents.
Not the first time I've been asked that.
Would people, Cowell drop by for supper or something?
Despite, there's always an impression when there are two, sort of heavy hitters in the household that the dinner conversation is of the highest nature, and that trends in this are being discussed, and that and so forth. And I'm sorry if anybody thinks so, but such is not the case. The fact is that they both worked at home, and so there were two typewriters going all the time. And it was an unusual atmosphere, but I was bussed out to school in the morning and bussed back. there were the parties were fun. I like musicians because they're a lively bunch, and they would all come in together, and then everybody would do perfect pitch tests on the piano and so forth. Very, very, I mean, like perfect pitch was an obsession with all of them. And they would play, somebody would play, da da da, what's that? And then everybody would guess, oh, that's the second movement or whatever. Of course, it had to be something. And in New York, my father, when I was in college, my father came down to New York, and then we went out, we had dinner with Varese and Cowell. Cowell was a lovely man. And Vernon Duke, Vladimir Dukelski, and Roy Harris also. He was a piece of work. And so that was fun. But, you know, at home, you know, have you done your homework and all that?
Wow,
yeah.
That's wonderful. I did find one, I'll just wrap this up with a quick citation, a reading of my own, not to take anything from you, please, from an article that your father wrote in 1947 about the trends in modern music, electronic, concrete, aleatoric music. Can one learn to appreciate and love music constructed according to such arbitrary specifications? Slonimsky writes, when my daughter, to whom this little book is dedicated, was an infant, I made an experiment. When she cried for her bottle, I happened to be babysitting, and I would play Chopin or other sweet music, but would not give her the bottle. Then I would switch abruptly to highly dissonant modern music and immediately would let her have her warm milk. I hoped that in time she would learn to associate pleasure with dissonance and frustration with sweet sounds, and get so conditioned to modern music. But the results of my experiments were disappointing. She grew up and lost all interest in music, whether sweet or sour, consonant or dissonant, and went into journalism instead. So my question is, have your tastes changed in music at all?
Obviously, the best thing that could have happened to me genetically is that I have no musical talent at all. And yes, I do drift to the modern, I would say.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
Interesting.
I would think so. I mean, I'm not a great concert goer, but I do. Well, I mean, I have to. I do have a high tolerance, but I'm really.
So perhaps your father's experiment was successful after all.
I think it was partially, yeah. I like musicians.
Yes.
Anybody have any other
That's
questions?
Wonderful. But can we open up to
Yeah.
the floor here? Questions.
Minor questions. What struggles was on his European tour?
Oh, it was
Men in Mountains?
Men in Mountains. Yeah.
What's Schoenberg on his Hollywood Bowl concert?
Well, I think they did the film. What is it called?
The Big Light Music.
Sorry? No, it's. Hold on. It's all of the programs. I think something for accompaniment for a film.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry.
We know what you're talking about.
Yeah, it's. Oh, accompaniment to a cinematic scene, Opus 34. Yeah, they didn't like that one either. Yeah. He had a series. He had something called fanfares at each concert. He decided in advance that he was going to have a fanfare. Some of them had already been written. Indeed, there's a publication called Fanfare from the 20s, and many famous composers wrote short fanfares for that publication. And he had some of those. He wrote one for himself, and he commissioned a few more. So each of the concerts had a short fanfare, two or three. The music under the cover of this is his fanfare that he used for his own, just a 2 or 3 minute opening. Any other questions? No?
One more thing. I saw a film of him singing a song that he had written on a setting of a ivory soap commercial.
Yes. No more shiny. No. No more shiny noses. Children. Yes. When he came to this country, he was fascinated by singing, by commercials and advertisements, because where he came from, it was sort of the Saturday Evening Post, and so he was fascinated by the advertisements and the jingles, and so he thought, well, I can do that too, and so he took the advertising, for example, Children Cry for Castoria. And so he took that and he wrote some satirical songs to them, and it's 5 advertising songs, and they are performed today because they're just very funny. And they were sort of from Saturday Evening Post advertisements. And he says, I wrote the first singing commercials. He was very interested in pop music because he wanted to make some money. And he looked around at the sheet music that was around, and he said, well, that's not really very advanced music. And he didn't think that, if Irving Berlin can do it, why can't I do it? And, if they make a lot of money, why can't I? And he tried, some of that, but, he didn't have the touch.
So, any questions? Well, I guess that's it then. Well, thank you all for coming. This has been wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.